So yeah, I've been thinking about this for a long time before finally writing it out. Feels weird putting it on something like Reddit, but I guess that's the point of confessions. Right. My name's William. Not my real name, obviously. I've told myself for years that what I did wasn't that serious. Just a sequence of bad decisions that spiraled. But every time I replay it in my head, it always comes back to the same moment, the call. The fake call. Before that, my life wasn't exactly stable. I was broke, bouncing between short-term jobs, and constantly feeling like I was one step behind everyone else. You know that feeling when you're not even surviving badly enough for people to notice, but not doing well enough to feel like you're moving forward? That was me. The idea didn't come from nowhere. It crept in slowly, shaped by desperation more than ambition. I kept telling myself it was harmless, that nobody would really get hurt, that it was just a shortcut through a system that didn't care about me anyway. That's how I justified it at first. The plan, if you can even call it that, revolved around a simple concept, a phone call that wasn't supposed to be real, but would be believable enough to shift how someone reacted to everything else. I didn't think of it as crime at the time. I thought of it as influence. Control. Something small that would tilt things in my favor without anyone noticing the hand behind it. Looking back now, that's probably the most dangerous part of it. How normal it felt before it happened. I remember the night before everything started. I barely slept. Not because I was nervous exactly, but because my brain wouldn't shut up. I kept replaying scenarios, like I was preparing for an exam I didn't understand the rules to. I kept telling myself, tomorrow, it's just a call. Just words. Nothing physical. Nothing real. But it was real. More real than I was ready for. And the thing is, I wasn't even thinking about consequences yet. I was thinking about execution. Timing. Tone of voice. What someone would believe if they heard the right kind of urgency on the other end of the line. I didn't realize then how much power there is in a voice when it sounds certain. Anyway, I guess I should start at the beginning of how I got to that point. Because the moment the phone rang, that fake call I set in motion, it didn't just change what happened next. It changed how everything before it suddenly looked like it was leading there all along. I didn't wake up one day and decide to ruin someone's life. It wasn't that dramatic. It was more like a slow accumulation of frustration and bad luck that eventually started to feel personal. At the time, I was working a dead-end admin job through a temp agency. Nothing impressive, just sorting documents and answering calls nobody wanted to answer. I used to listen to people lie on the phone all day, clients, managers, even coworkers. It sounds ironic now, but that's where it started to shift in my head. I noticed how easily things moved when someone sounded confident. Not necessarily right, just confident. People don't question tone as much as they should. There was this one day, a situation at work where a misunderstanding got resolved just because someone, important sounding, called and confirmed something vague. No proof, no verification. Just authority in a voice. That stuck with me more than it should have. I started thinking, what if the voice itself was enough? That's when the idea stopped being abstract. That's the part one always skip over in my head, but it matters. There was someone at the agency. I'll call him Mark. Not because I'm protecting him, just because I don't want to drag real names into this. Mark wasn't special in any obvious way. Quiet, routine guy, always a bit stressed, always checking his phone like something bad was about to happen. We worked in the same building but different departments. I didn't know him personally at first. I just knew he had access to something I didn't, and that he was already under pressure from above. He was the kind of person who looked like he believed everything was hanging by a thread. That's not me insulting him, that's just how he carried himself. One day we ended up in a short conversation near the printer. Small talk. Nothing important. But I noticed how quickly he accepted information if it sounded official. That was the moment the idea stopped being theoretical and started attaching itself to a real person. I started building it like a script, almost like writing dialogue for a play. The fake call wasn't just a random lie. I needed it to sound like it belonged in the system Mark already trusted. That meant tone mattered more than content. I spent days thinking about phrasing, short sentences, controlled urgency, no unnecessary emotion. I remember writing lines in my notes app like, "We need confirmation on file transfer. This is escalation level 2. Stuff that sounds boring on purpose, because boring sounds official. The idea wasn't to trick Mark into believing something impossible. It was to make him assume the situation was already decided above his level. I also planned timing carefully. I didn't want him relaxed. I wanted him mid-task, slightly overwhelmed, so he wouldn't pause long enough to question anything. Even the phone number mattered. I researched how internal calls were displayed in the system. I wasn't hacking anything dramatic, just observing patterns, how numbers appeared, how extensions were formatted. Looking back, it feels insane how much mental energy I put into something I kept telling myself was small. The morning it actually happened felt strangely normal. That's the part that still bothers me. I went to work like usual, got coffee that tasted like burnt water, sat at my desk, and acted like nothing in my head was about to change. I remember checking my hands a few times without knowing why. They didn't shake. I thought they would. Mark was already there, same as always, slightly tense, moving between tasks like he was trying to outrun something invisible. Perfect condition, honestly. If I had planned a worse scenario, I probably couldn't have. I told myself it was just a trigger event. That's how I framed it in my head. Not a crime, not manipulation, just a trigger that would set off a chain reaction that was already possible within the system. That's how I stayed calm. By pretending I wasn't creating anything new, just nudging something that already existed. When the moment came, I didn't hesitate. I just acted like I had rehearsed it enough times that hesitation wasn't part of the equation anymore. And then the call started. I remember the exact second I pressed the button. There wasn't any dramatic sound or cinematic feeling. Just a normal connection tone, like any other work call. That's what made it worse in hindsight. It blended in too easily. I used a voice I practiced in my head more times than I cared to admit. Calm, slightly detached, like someone reading from a protocol rather than speaking spontaneously. "Internal compliance check," I said. Those were the first words. There was a pause on the other end. Mark didn't speak immediately, which was expected. People rarely do when they hear something that sounds official but unfamiliar. I continued with the script I had built. "We need immediate confirmation regarding pending authorization on your active case file." Even typing it now feels ridiculous, but at the time it sounded powerful. Structured. Unquestionable. Mark asked a question. I don't even remember the exact wording, but I remember the tone, uncertain, but cooperative. That was the moment I realized how little resistance there actually is when someone believes they're already supposed to comply. This is where things stopped feeling like planning and started feeling like momentum. Mark didn't question the call in any meaningful way. He asked procedural questions, the kind people ask when they're trying not to look incompetent rather than trying to stop something from happening. I adapted in real time, which I wasn't fully prepared for. The script I had written was more of a framework than a rigid dialogue, and suddenly I was filling gaps I hadn't fully thought through. Every answer I gave was designed to sound like it came from somewhere higher than him. That was the key. Not authority through aggression, authority through distance. What surprised me most wasn't that he believed it, but how quickly he aligned himself with it. Like his brain had already accepted that resistance wasn't an option worth considering. There was a point where I almost broke character. Not out of guilt yet, just out of disbelief that something so simple was actually unfolding. But I didn't stop. I couldn't tell if I was controlling the situation anymore or just keeping up with it. Something shifted when Mark said he would handle it immediately. That wasn't in my script. Up until then, I felt like I was steering the conversation, even if only loosely. But that sentence changed the direction. It implied urgency I didn't explicitly instruct, which meant he was interpreting the situation in his own way now. I remember thinking, this is good, this is what I wanted. But at the same time, it felt slightly off, like a machine responding faster than expected and skipping steps you assumed were necessary. He started moving while still on the call. I could hear it, chair scraping, papers shifting, that rushed breathing people get when they switch into problem-solving mode. I tried to reinforce control with a final line. This must remain confidential until escalation completes. It sounded stronger in my head than it did out loud. He agreed immediately. That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't really directing him anymore. I was just providing a framework, and his own fear was filling in the rest. After Mark ended the call, I expected, I don't know, a pause. Some kind of reset where I could step back and think, okay, that's done. But nothing paused. Instead, everything accelerated. Within minutes, I started seeing movement in the system, emails being forwarded, internal messages popping up, people reacting to something I wasn't directly part of anymore. That's when it hit me. The fake call wasn't the event. It was just the ignition. Mark was acting like the call had real consequences attached to it, and because others trusted Mark, they started reacting too. I remember staring at my screen, realizing I couldn't fully track what was happening anymore. It was branching out beyond my control in ways I hadn't properly accounted for. That's when the discomfort started creeping in. Not fear exactly, more like loss of ownership. I told myself it was still contained. Still reversible. Just a misunderstanding being processed through normal channels. But deep down, I knew I had introduced something into a system that didn't need me to keep it moving anymore. This is the part where I stopped feeling like I was doing anything at all. Once the process spread beyond Mark, it became self-sustaining. Different departments started reacting independently, each one responding to fragments of information I had indirectly triggered. Nobody saw the full picture, just their piece of it. I remember watching it unfold like a chain reaction I could no longer reach into. Messages were being escalated, approvals paused, questions asked at higher levels. And the strangest thing? No one questioned the origin anymore. The fake call was already accepted as initial input, even though no one had properly verified it. That realization made my stomach drop later, but at the time, I was still partly detached. Still convincing myself it was just bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does. But I also started noticing something else. The more people reacted, the more real it became. Not in theory, in structure. It was like reality was being rewritten by repetition. And I had no idea where the end point was supposed to be anymore. I didn't expect Mark to come back into the story so directly. A few hours after the initial call, he reached out to me. Not formally, just a message. Something along the lines of asking if I had heard anything else, or if the escalation was normal. That message hit me harder than I expected. Because in his mind, I was now part of the system. Not the trigger, not the source of confusion, but a reference point. I had to answer carefully. I kept it vague, reinforcing the same idea, that things were being processed above our level, and it was better not to interfere. Even typing that felt surreal. I was actively sustaining something I created, but now I had to do it indirectly, through reassurance rather than instruction. What surprised me most was that Mark didn't sound angry or suspicious. He sounded relieved to have someone confirm that the confusion wasn't his fault. That's when I realized the most powerful part of the fake call wasn't deception. It was how quickly people outsource certainty when they're stressed. Things started leaking beyond the workplace. Not in a dramatic, "Police are here" way, nothing like that. More subtle. Plans got delayed. Decisions that usually took hours stretched into days. People started referencing the escalation issue, like it was an established event everyone understood. I remember overhearing a conversation where someone said, "We're still waiting on confirmation from the upper channel." That phrase made my stomach twist, because I knew exactly what upper channel was supposed to be, and it wasn't real. But now it was treated like it was. That's when I started realizing I couldn't quietly undo it. Even if I stepped in and said nothing was legitimate, I didn't control the network of belief anymore. And for the first time, I felt something close to panic, not because I thought I'd be caught, but because I understood I had created a problem that didn't require me to keep lying for it to continue existing. It had already been accepted into the system's logic. I told myself I could still contain it if I acted carefully. So I started doing the opposite of what I did before. I began introducing clarifications, small corrections, casual mentions that maybe there had been some confusion, that certain steps might have been misunderstood. But it didn't work the way I expected. Instead of collapsing, the system just absorbed those corrections and reinterpreted them. My attempts to reduce the situation were treated as updates, not reversals. That was the moment I understood something uncomfortable. Once enough people accept a version of reality, even contradictions don't erase it, they just get incorporated. I remember sitting at my desk after one of those attempts, staring at my screen, realizing I had no clean exit anymore. Every direction I turned seemed to reinforce the same structure. And worse, I had to keep acting normal while it was happening. Because any visible panic would have raised questions I couldn't afford. So I stayed in it. Quietly. Watching it evolve. Telling myself I still had control, even when I knew I didn't. The turning point wasn't loud. It was a message. Not from Mark this time, but from someone higher up in the chain asking for a formal clarification of the original directive source. That's when my chest went cold. Because there was no source. There never was. Just me, a script, and a phone call that was never supposed to be traced this far up. I remember reading that message over and over, realizing the situation had grown beyond workplace confusion and into something that required accountability. For the first time, I genuinely considered the possibility that I would be exposed, not immediately, but eventually, when enough inconsistencies stacked up. What made it worse was how calm everything still looked on the surface. No alarms, no accusations, just polite procedural language slowly tightening around something I had started. That's when fear finally replaced adrenaline. Not fear of punishment exactly, but fear of inevitability. Like I had built something that no longer needed me, but could still collapse on top of me if examined closely enough. I didn't get the dramatic ending I used to imagine in my head. No sudden exposure, no big confrontation, nothing cinematic. It just unraveled slowly. Over time, the situation got reclassified internally as a procedural miscommunication. That phrase still annoys me, because it hides how many people participated in believing something that never had a real origin. Things eventually settled. People moved on. Systems corrected themselves in their own way, absorbing the error and smoothing it out like it was never sharp to begin with. But I didn't move on the same way. For a long time after, I couldn't separate how easily it all worked from how wrong it felt in hindsight. The fake call wasn't powerful because it was clever. It was powerful because people were already ready to believe it. That's what stuck with me the most. If there's anything I learned, it's that systems don't need truth to function, just consistency. And people, when under pressure, will often choose structure over doubt. My advice? Be careful with the small things you think won't matter. Sometimes they don't just matter, they multiply.